Grand. So I have started the live stream to YouTube Live, and we're going to start the presentations for Social Art Network London. One of the things that I want to just reference is that the times that we're living in are incredibly urgent. They're incredibly powerful. They can be incredibly difficult. So I have started the live stream, and a lot of artists are working in sites of intense, precarious situations with very vulnerable people, or we're trying to figure out how to even do the work, or we're working in ways in which we're not sure how it crosses over with our artwork in terms of like mutual aid and sharing. And we talk a lot about self-care in the arts around social practice. And what we'll talk about today is how we devote ourselves to a project's aftercare, particularly how we might think about archiving and documenting material while we're creating material. And the presenters we have today will explore that. Before we start our presentations, I would like to begin with a poem. It is the Social Art Network meetups, so I thought we need some art in the room, so I thought I'd bring a piece of poetry. I have been feeling incredibly overwhelmed by the civil rights movement and anti-racist movement that has been happening, and the incredible importance of supporting Black Lives Matter. And also the social insurrection that has been happening in Chile, which is the country where my family is from. And I thought I would share a poem by Pablo Neruda called Educación del Cacique, Education of the Chieftain. It is about Lautaro, a very famous Mapuche. The Mapuches were the indigenous people of Chile, and he resisted the Spanish settlement in Chile. He was taken as a slave for a long time, and he learned the ways of the Spanish. And when he escaped, he used it to almost defeat them. Education of the Chieftain by Pablo Neruda. Lautaro was a slender arrow. Supple and blue was our father. His first years were all silence. His adolescence, authority. His youth, an aimed wind. He trained himself like a long lance. He habituated his feet in cascades. He schooled his head among thorns. He executed the essays of the Guanaco. He lived in the burrows of the snow. He ambushed the prey of eagles. He scratched the secrets from crags. He allayed the petals of fire. He suckled cold springtime. He burned in infernal gorges. He was a hunter among cruel birds. His mantle was stained with victories. He perused the night's aggressions. He bore the sulfur landslides. He made himself velocity, sudden light. He took on the sluggishness of autumn. He worked with the invisible haunts. He slept under the sheets of snowdrifts. He equaled the conduct of arrows. He drank wild blood on the roads. He wrested treasure from the waves. He made himself a menace like a somber god. He ate from each fire of his people. He learned the alphabet of the lightning. He scented the scattered ash. He wrapped his heart in black skins. He deciphered the spiral thread of smoke. He made himself out of taciturn fibers. He oiled himself like the soul of the olive. He became glass of transparent hardness. He studied to be a hurricane wind. He fought himself until his blood was extinguished. Solo entonces fue digno de su pueblo. Only then was he worthy of his people. Something to think about in these times of resistance. So we're going to begin the presentations, and I'm going to invite Lucy Wright, who's an artist and a researcher, and will be sharing some of the work that she has been doing.
Hi. Okay, hi. Huge thanks to Marcelo for inviting me to speak today, and to everyone in the room for letting me be part of this first digital SAN London meetup. As Marcelo says, my name's Lucy. I'm an artist and a researcher living in Leeds. and I work for an independent arts charity called Axisweb, which is based in Wakefield in West Yorkshire. If you don't know about them, Axis is an online membership organisation dedicated to supporting artists and profiling the work that they do. We have a digital platform where you can, amongst other things, find out about opportunities that are happening, connect with other artists, share your news, apply for one of our awards or commissions. We have films and podcasts and access to vacant space properties, or we did prior to the lockdown. And we also offer reasonably priced public liability insurance in case you were in the market for some at any time coming up. Axis supports artists of all genres and media, but in recent years has placed special emphasis on developing our provision around social practice, in recognition of the fact that an increasing number of our members make work in social settings at least some of the time. I've been working with Axis on and off since about 2015, but in a more formal role since January 2019. And it started off working on a research project, a KTP, knowledge transfer partnership with Manchester Metropolitan University called Models of Validation, which was concerned with better understanding the values and needs of social practitioners, kind of aware that social practice has a set of different requirements and conditions than more gallery-based practice, or it can do. And I also helped to coordinate a parallel programme of commissions and events called Social Works, which ran alongside that. I have a social practice myself, so this has been an amazing opportunity to get more involved in this amazing community of artists and to help develop new frameworks to support the really important work that is going on out there right now. Not so incidentally, Axis is also partnering with Social Art Network at the moment, which is a massive privilege. I'm so happy about this. And we were recently fortunate enough to be awarded some funding to collaborate on a new project called the Social ARTery, and also a sort of a related project, the Social Art Library, which is going to be the subject of my talk this evening. So I should probably say before we even begin that the Social Art Library is very much a work in progress at this stage. It's the result of a lot of different conversations that we've been having over a number of months now, both within our team at Axis and with some of the artists that we've been working with as part of the Social Works programme. And it's also something that has had to be fairly fundamentally re-envisaged on account of the COVID-19 crisis. We were just sort of on the cusp of putting in a grant to the Arts Council before the lockdown happened, and it was around more face-to-face workshops and meetups. And we've had to take a step back since the pandemic and kind of think about what's going to be possible now and what our priorities are. Happily, this hasn't meant abandoning the project altogether. I think it's actually meant that what we're going to be able to do is going to be more accessible to more people than it initially was going to be. So that's a really good thing. It is a really ambitious project, so that's very exciting, but also really scary. So here's the idea, it's in progress. What if there was a comprehensive and fully accessible online library for and about socially engaged practice? What if it included resources to help people make things happen in their local communities, as well as documentation of projects that have already happened? What if you could go there to find out information about social practice, so books, articles, photographs, films, whatever, and you could submit stuff about your own projects too. So your writings, your photographs, your material, ephemera, whatever you want to tell the story of the projects that you are doing or have done in the past. And what if there were a series of residencies and commissions that enabled artists to get involved in the Social Art Library as kind of curators, as librarians, to kind of, to really shape how this thing works and how it looks? And what if we could amplify diverse voices within that and make sure that everyone involved in projects, not just artists, maybe participants too, would have an opportunity to tell their story and have that made available and shared with the rest of the community? This is something that we have sort of started doing in a very, very tentative sort of a way in the past. We have a beta platform that I'm going to try and share my screen now to show you. And this is very, very much a kind of, a basic version. It's not representative of what the final thing we hope will be. I'm just seeing if it will let me share my screen. Has anything happened at your end? Oh, I think I have to change my sorry. Is anything happening? No.
Yeah, it's on now.
Is it on? Excellent. I'm so sorry about that. I'm still very much a Luddite. This is the first time I've ever done screen sharing in Zoom. So this is the social art library that we came up with, and this is months old now. It was just very much a mock-up, and it's not including so many of the kind of projects that I'm talking about. This is more kind of resources that we know to be out there. So I'll just very quickly sort of show you a few of the features. So we have a search function here at the center, which, you know, we want it to be kind of a Google thing so that you can put in a keyword term for something that you're interested in and maybe find a bunch of stuff that's going to be useful for, you know, for what you're doing. So I'm going to put in a lot of my work is to do with folk arts and tradition. So I'm going to put in folk, because in fact that's probably going to bring up my stuff, isn't it? What word should I put in? What would be a good thing to have? Let's go with migration, see if anything comes up for that. This will be embarrassing if nothing comes up. So put in migration, something of mine does come up, but let's ignore that one. A bunch of different options come up. Let's click on this one. This is obviously someone highly involved in social art network. This is Elon's project, Futurist Women from 2018. And so there'll be a little bit of information about the project, and then links to more information. There's some biography details. There's also links. There will hopefully be links to other things that might be related to this. Similarly, there's an opportunity to submit an entry, whether it will actually let me do that now. So if you want to submit something of your own, there's a form that you can fill in to give details of what it is that you want to do. Is it going to be a toolkit, a template, a video, some research, whatever? Again, we'll kind of determine what kinds of category we'll use later on, but it's we want to make it as kind of interactive as possible. So that's just to give a kind of very loose idea of what we've come up with so far. But as I say, I think that what we have in mind is something much more kind of, I think, more interactive, and that will, you know, be more of a sandbox for doing a lot of different things, not just searching things like on Google. So, but why is a library for social practice important? I know that there are a few examples of projects like this happening elsewhere in different ways, but I think the reason why a library of social practice is so important to me is that it starts with how the history of social practice is told and who gets to tell it. I remember when I was starting out as a social practitioner a few years ago, but not that long ago, I found it really difficult to find a lot of information about social practice. There seemed to be a special lack of stuff from an artist's perspective. So I knew about the big core text, you know, I knew about Grant Kester and, you know, Claire Bishop and Nicholas Bourriot. And they included the odd examples of projects that were happening, but they were often quite high profile. And there wasn't a lot that reflected the kind of work that I know to be going on, you know, in the communities around where I live right now, for example, though it just seemed very difficult to find this out. And there was even less that dealt with, you know, showcasing the voices of participants and collaborators in these projects. So, you know, I was at that time working by myself in a community in the northwest of England, making work that kind of didn't look like art, and not really feeling like I had a suitable terminology for dealing with that, or a community that I could tap into to kind of, you know, to learn more, to, you know, to feel connected. Social Art Network has been a huge, you know, movement here in you know, to make more of that happen, and that's really, really exciting. But the research that I've been doing at Axis over the last couple of years has kind of suggested that there's still a long way to go. Social practice still lacks visibility in the art world at large, and there's a lack of sort of infrastructure for artists to connect with each other in ways that feel meaningful and kind of opposite to the values that we have as practitioners. And at the same time as the need for better visibility and the channels to share what we do, there's also this issue of producing documentation of our work in ways that feel meaningful to us and representative of the projects that we're doing. It sort of strikes me as one of those ironies of social practice that many of us are very sort of skilled at enabling other people to tell their stories and to share their stories, but we're often maybe less good at doing it for and about ourselves. And to some extent, this is just part of what social practice is. You know, we're often less interested in creating objects and images. We often work on our own. We're often working on a lot of things at the same time. We're on a very low budget, and producing high quality documentation is kind of a step too far. It's just, it's something that we don't have the time to do. I was saying to Marcelo just the other day about this, that I'm working on a project on my weekends during lockdown. It's one of those projects that I don't get that much time to work on, but I'm doing the odd bit here and there. And, I'm enjoying it. It's going okay. And I realized the other day that I've actually documented nothing whatsoever of it. I have nothing to show for these things that I've been doing. And, there is that thing of, if there isn't a photograph, did it really happen? Of course it did, but it would be nice to be, making more of a record of these things, especially so that the knowledge that all of us have as practitioners can be shared with each other, and it doesn't just sort of go off into the ether. So I think too often the documentation that we end up producing for the projects that we do, especially for funded projects, is something that we do for funders more than for ourselves. We're doing it to demonstrate that we have satisfied particular preset conditions, and not so much about, representing the work we've done in ways that in any way come close to matching the experience of being part of that project. And at the same time, a lot of that information is, where it does exist, there is some really high quality documentation for sure. And where it does exist, it's quite dispersed. We put it on our website, but unless someone knows to go to look at your website, how do they find out about it? One of the taglines I saw for this event today was, our history, our power, let's build it. And I think this idea is amazing, and it sits at the heart of the motivation for the Social Art Library. We started drawing up a set of principles a while back, and one of the first things that we put on the list was that the history of social practice shouldn't be left to academics to define solely. It should be a shared concern for all those involved in social projects, from artists to producers to the people that they work with, the communities that they work with. And we really want the library to be this open, egalitarian space for everyone to have an opportunity to define, social practice. And at the same time, we want to interpret the idea of library really broadly. I think sometimes libraries are sort of stereotyped as spaces that are very rule bound, they're very formal, you have to be quiet, maybe you have to wear white gloves to handle some of the things. But actually, I think it was Marcelo who spotted that in the Arts Council's 10-year strategy document, libraries are the most far-reaching and utilised cultural spaces in the country, which suggests that they're also these amazing community hubs. They're sites for learning and exchange. They're fundamentally democratic. So we want our library to be a kind of radical space. We want it to be somewhere that is accessible to all, where everyone not only gets to come and take something from the library, but they get to put something in whatever way they wish to do that. So having a library card to the Social Art Library isn't just about accessing materials, it's about creating them and organising them as well. And we know that knowledge about social practice isn't only contained in written text. It doesn't have to be a very formalised document, something really polished. It can be something very ephemeral, and that's just as valuable. We need some way of organising that and finding ways to tell stories, but we want to be very open to lots of different kinds of documentation styles. It's an ambitious project. So I'm going to shut up now pretty much, but I just wanted to say that we're just at the very, very beginning of this project. We've only just found out that we have the opportunity to actually make a start with this with some funding. I hope you'll forgive the relatively sketchy plan of it tonight, but I wanted to share it this evening with you, even though it is in this very embryonic form, because it's an open invitation to everyone who's here tonight to come on board with us and help us to shape it. We want to make this as valuable and as alive as it possibly can be. And everything is still up for grabs. So it would be amazing to hear from you and to work with you on this as we go forward with it. Thank you very much for listening to me, and looking forward to the rest of the evening.
Great, thank you, Lucy. That's fantastic. It's really exciting. And actually there's quite a few libraries that are out there and that are being built. I know that Rufus is here, who is somebody I've chatted to about a library they're building as well. And I think this is really the thing with Social Art Network, and the thing about the work that we all do is that we are working in tandem. We are all supporting each other. We all want the sector to thrive because we are committed to social justice and community development. I'm going to very briefly just add to Lucy's presentation that part of the library, as this archive, but potentially this living space, is linked together with Axisweb, which is really they're rebranding and they're redeveloping. And if you know Axisweb, they're one of the places where was the first places that artists could have digital representation before we all had like websites. You know, they started in '91, so it was quite a big deal. But now they're engaging in really a new way of thinking of how to come together, which is one of the projects I'm working on them with. And that is how to develop their exchange platform. And within that, something called the social artery. The social artery is going to be a space where we can bring collaborative work online, because our medium is working with people. Right now, during the lockdown, we are divorced from our medium. We don't have the kind of studio practice where we can just go hang out with our working mediums, because we are currently now divorced from them. It's very challenging. Again, something that's prototyped, I will share an image of it so that you can see basically what they are building here, and you can take a look at. And this is all, again, it's not even a beta version, it's an alpha version. I just learned this. Before a beta version, you have an alpha version. And it's, you know, it's a bit of Facebook, LinkedIn, Google Docs, all mashed into one place. So it will look a bit like this. It will be a place where you could potentially run a course, but more importantly, it will be a place also where you can have a live event or a happening. And that live event or that happening can be somewhere where we can do what we are doing now, like this Zoom chat, and maybe just drop it into that space, but we can maybe bring in a YouTube video, maybe we can bring in a gallery of images, maybe we can bring in some sort of interactive whiteboard. It is being designed. More importantly, there's some money to micro commission across that. And that is something that will be happening through Social Art Network, that offer through Axisweb, and that is fantastic, as well as populating the social art library. So some micro commissions there in terms of being able to give artists some funds to think about how they might specifically archive. Can we think about radical archiving? How might that be different? We don't have to have the answers. We have a hive mind. We can come up with those answers together. So we're trying to take advantage of us being pushed into these spaces to be radical and be creative, but also be participatory. With that, thank you, Lucy. And we're going to, I'm going to pass the talking stick over to Dom. Thank you, Dom, for joining us from the Museum of London.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thanks, Marcelo and Sun London for inviting me. It's very excited to be here for a number of reasons. First, because this is kind of my natural environment. So I'm really interested, particularly in the conversation that we can have later, and also because I've got lots to learn from you guys. Because I come from a museum perspective, and museums are particularly and traditionally quite behind all the discussions about recording processes and putting processes at the heart of their activity. I'm just going to give you a little bit of background about myself, and then focus the next 10 minutes on our COVID collecting project, from which I'm responsible together with other colleagues of, and then leave you with a couple of provocations that I hope that we can discuss in the breakout room as a consequence of the sort of questions that the team at the museum have been considering during collecting COVID. Just a bit of background about myself. So I'm an anthropologist by training. I've been working in museums for quite some time, particularly museums holding collections of ethnography. And my kind of lineage and my kind of entry point into these discussions is about the interest in bringing the process of museum collecting and of collaborating with communities at the heart of exhibition and display. There's one of the things that often happens when you walk into an exhibition, as you know, is that you see objects and stories almost completely decontextualized from the act and processes of collecting. And so in my practice, I've been trying to sort of investigate what does it mean to work with communities and collect and research together with community. And now we can sort of integrate these processes, these curatorial processes into exhibition and display. But it's fundamentally also about something else. It's fundamentally about knowledge and the sort of considering museums not as the official authoritative knowledge over a particular subject, but also as a platform where you can have multiplicity of voices. And when particularly the knowledge that comes from the lived experience of communities and individuals is not only recognized, but also legitimized alongside academic practice. So and basically, I'm just telling you this to say I'm kind of an ally on the ideas and urgency of collecting processes as well as product, if you allow me the kind of simplification. And I think that we in the museum have got lots to learn from you. And the discussion that Lucy was introducing was very interesting, particularly for this respect, because we still also lack the tools to reflect very thoroughly on these processes and to showcase these processes too. In my own practice, I've developed particularly collaborative approaches with refugees communities and forced migrants more in particular. But here at the Museum of London, I lead a team of curators and researchers that are particularly concerned with issues of contemporary collecting in London. So we are working all around London in different areas of the city to work in collaboration with the community to build a sort of long-term partnership to collaborate with communities in the process of collecting objects and stories. But then COVID happened. So COVID happened and our work had to be remodeled and to be had to be sort of adapt to the changing circumstances. And to some extent, we're posing the traditional work of Curating London. And we started to question as a team, what does it mean to collect COVID in times of personal and collective crisis, particularly. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the project, the COVID Collecting Project. COVID Collecting Project is it's something that all the Curating London, the curatorial team of London is involved in. It's about 16 curators, and each one have got their own expertise, of course, which feeds it into the collecting projects. But we have three main strands. They look at collecting sort of stories and objects in response to the experience of young people. But we are also looking at digital collecting and also material culture and objects that are being suggested via call out. So you probably are aware that the Museum of London, alongside many other museums, including Wellcome, that is represented this evening, has gone out publicly to ask Londoners to come back with suggestions. And we're going through at the moment through this kind of a very extensive list of suggestions that come from the lived experience of individuals. But what I would like to focus on this evening are particularly two questions, one concerning matters of voices, and the other one about questions of urgency, which is referred to in the title of the meetup. When we started to think about how to approach collecting COVID, one of the first things that we did was to look back at our what else do we have in our collection that reflects past pandemic. So I think that not even the Wellcome Collection possibly has got a strand that is called pandemic objects, but I might be proved wrong. So we had to look kind of deep and see basically what the stories of how the stories of past pandemic were told, and more importantly, whose voices were we were hearing. And this is particularly important because I mean, as we learn from Camus and the plague and all of that, in times of pandemics, in times of social unrest and deep structural inequality come to the surface. And the matter of reflecting those voices into the collection is a fundamental ethical question. So we also had a little bit of an expertise on pandemic. We you might be aware, like in 2008, we had a premonitory exhibition in a way that was called Disease X. What will be London next pandemics. Here you go. 2 years later, we faced the response to the question. So we had a little bit of an institutional knowledge, or rather like of thinking around how can we reflect a broad spectrum of experiences. And when I refer to voices and we're referring about the need of understanding what narratives are reflected, I'm thinking particularly, but not exclusively, at privilege, and both our privilege as kind of curators and white curators of replicating particular views of the pandemic, particularly reflecting middle class sensibilities, perhaps, which are not, which are generally associated to the museum as a kind of a cultural capital thing. And so one way of doing this was to start thinking about, to work with the communities, some of the communities we already have contact with, to harness the diversification of voices in the pandemic. I'll give you an example. We did in the last month, in the month of May, which was also the month of Ramadan, we launched 3 contemporary collecting projects around Ramadan in lockdown. So we worked extensively with young people in the community to look at, to young Muslim, to look at their experience of Ramadan for a multimedia project. We also looked at experiences of families, Muslim families all around London, and also worked in collaboration with a small mosque in Hackney, which was Hackney was one of the few boroughs, I believe also actually the only one, to exceptionally allow mosques in the borough to perform the Adhan prayer in the evening, the sort of call to prayer. So we recorded that as well. And I'm aware that I've got only 2 minutes. So the second provocation, alongside the one of whose voices should be and could be represented in collecting a pandemic, is the question of urgency. The way I read urgency in the context of the title is actually around conversations of so-called rapid response collecting. And obviously the word urgency resonates with the word rapid. And rapid response collecting, for those that are not sort of in the museum jargon, is associated to that type of collecting that to some degree was initiated by the V&A a few years ago, of essentially responding quite literally in a rapid fashion to event emerging in a space, in this context in London. My question / provocation around this is, can we really do rapid response collecting in a landscape of loss and trauma, and completely redesigning and reassessing of individual and collective identities? And what does it mean to consider very carefully the ethics of response collecting? And can this be slowed down? Can we think about a sort of like slow food version of rapid response collecting that can mitigate the sort of ethical challenges of responding so rapidly to something like a pandemic? And I will stop there because I'm aware that I probably have gone off over time, but I'll be very, very happy to pick up some of the provocations in the breakout room and answer any other questions that you have about the project.
Great. Thank you, Dom. That was fantastic. Lots to think about, and really good systems to learn from, especially the idea of rapid response collecting while we're thinking about our own practices and how we can be engaging in potentially radical archiving. I will pass the baton over to George. Thanks, George, for coming.
Thank you, Marcello, and thanks for the invitation. It's great to be with you all and discuss a bit of my work. Wellcome Collection. And to give you a bit of context about my background, I'm a curator and writer, primarily in contemporary art, and I'm more used to kind of working within commissioning and exhibition making. So I feel like I probably bring quite a different kind of perspective. I was invited today to talk about my work on the Joe Spence estate, which I've been involved in on and off over 10 years, and how I met Marcello originally. So yeah, I've written a text which I'm going to read out, and then I'm just going to try and share my screen and show you some pictures of Joe Spence's work for those of you that aren't aware of it. Yeah, and it should take about 10 minutes. So let me try sharing my screen. Can people see this? Is that okay, Marcello? Okay. So the artist Labani Himid once said something to me along the lines of, I want to own space in the institution, not rent it. I'm paraphrasing from memory, but my understanding of what Himid was saying was that invitations are fine, but until the work of Black artists is properly archived and collected by national institutions, there's little actual progress. I'm reminded of Himid's words when reflecting on today's theme around the urgency of collecting socially engaged and political artworks. And I've been invited to speak in light of my own work on the Joe Spence estate. So to give you a bit more context here, I co-curated Joe Spence and Wright ARTery Misbehaving Bodies at Wellcome Collection in 2019, a project that was originally initiated by the curator Barbara Rodriguez Muñoz. And I helped to archive Spence's estate in 2012-2013, and I've worked on shows at Space, Studio Voltaire and Richard Saltoun. In the 7 years since then, Spence's work has become increasingly visible and acquired by public institutions, and I wanted to use this text to briefly reflect on Spence's work in relation to her own strategies around archiving and the possibilities and problems that this poses institutions. So Spence was a photographer active from the mid-60s to her untimely death in 1992. Her work addressed injustice and feminist concerns, and her most significant work dealt with her treatment for breast cancer in 1982 in advocacy for alternative treatments. Her work was direct, critical, and often very funny, using humour to disarm the spectator and address traumatic themes. She centred her own body, putting herself into the picture to use herself as a kind of nexus in which to politicise sickness and explore themes of visibility through the lens of gender, ageing, and class. Her practice is myriad and complex, and I urge you, if you haven't already, to spend more time with it. Spence's early documentary photography and her later works, which constitute mainly performances to camera as a form of therapeutic practice, which were made in collaboration with Rosie Martin, I think can be seen as a type of counter-archive, documenting histories and stories that typically remain outside the gaze of the photographer's attention. Illness, divorce, mental health, labour and care. These are subjects that are systemically written out of the archive of institutions. They're marginalised and silenced, and Spence hones her eye forensically on these subjects. It's important to state that Spence never saw herself as an artist. She didn't use that term. She called herself a cultural worker and saw her work as educational. Her work was typically shown in libraries and community centres, and she often laminated the works to strengthen them so that she could post them through to people in the postal service. And I encountered many letters in the archive with Spence complaining about her work coming back damaged with tea stains. And while Spence's work has become incredibly valuable in the last 10, 15 years, it was never really bought and sold on these terms while she was alive. There's a certain messiness and eclecticism to the work, which I would argue is very much part of Spence's strategy. So photographs are printed and cropped at different scales. The same image appears in separate works with alternate titles. The photographs are also uneditioned. She worked with a team of collaborators often, and it's very difficult to ascertain who took the photographs. There were no contracts, only verbal agreements. And her archive, when I first encountered it, was just piles of photographs, negatives, and scrapbooks. And it's very difficult to tell the difference between the work and the research, and the space between her life and labour was continually blurred. Much of the estate now has been dispersed, and it's interesting to think that Spence's work is now split between university archives at Birkbeck, galleries and museums such as the V&A, Tate and Wellcome Collection. Charlene Heath, who's an archivist at the Ryerson Institute, of which they have quite a lot of the Spence material now, has called it a kind of anarchist archive and argues that Spence's archival approach, very much embedded in her practice as an artist, is a feminist strategy. For Spence, the image becomes like a body and it changes over time. She returns to it, remixes it. Meaning is kept in flux, and Spence undermines the notion of photographic veracity. So there's no sense of a singular truth, there's kind of a multiplicity of truths. Much of her work that you now see is also printed posthumously, and this was actually often, again, quite a deliberate strategy, with her collaborator Terry Dennett tasked with printing the work from her deathbed. And there's something about her trying to defeat the finality of death, I think, in this process. So I think Spence's archival approach is incredibly important and preempts many of the digital strategies that we now encounter, with images being used as kind of units of exchange and as a way of creating communities. Spence saw her work really as a seed planted within the viewer in an aim to kind of empower them to take their own photographs. And her wish was that everybody would have a camera in their pocket to document the good, the bad, and the ugly part of their lives and narrate more kind of authentic experience. And I think obviously this has kind of come to fruition, but you could argue whether the ubiquity of the camera has led to the kind of emancipatory effects that Spence intended. So Spence's practice, I think, is influential to a generation of artists who have utilised social media platforms to record, publicise and distribute their work, publicly archiving in real time and networking their concerns with their peers. I think this collapsing of space between the private and the public and the opportunities afforded to people to amplify their voices is incredibly important, but not without its own issues. These platforms are, of course, centralized and commoditized spaces built on models for harvesting as much data off people as possible. I think what's interesting about Spence's practice is that we have to kind of broaden the frame to see it all together, the writing, photography, and teaching. And in the absence of market and institutional support during her life, these energies were really a necessary form of self-archiving, with Spence playing the role of producer, curator, and critic all in one. Of course, much has changed now. Her work has been cited by artists, academics, and cultural practitioners. But what really surprised me working on Misbehaving Bodies last year was the amount of healthcare professionals that knew the work. There was a lot of people in the broader community that knew the work, if not the art world itself, which I think has changed. So the artist and writer Felicity Allen, who's someone else I've worked with, coined the term the desoeuvre, which I think is a really interesting word. And she uses it to articulate a type of political and feminist practice that often sits outside of institutional archives. And this word by Allen is used to kind of articulate an oeuvre that is not recognizable, that shifts direction and isn't supported by the market. So artists often have to take up positions in educational environments and community spaces to take on a salary. The work's not often collected, and it's very difficult institutionally to ascertain clear career trajectories because many of these artists often take a break from exhibiting. These histories tend to be archived in people's memories, stored under people's beds, out of date technology, and distributed, I think, through oral histories, community collections, and online networks. So, what to make of Spence's work? Is it a counter-archive or an anarchic archive? I think it's a desoeuvre that leaves as many questions unanswered. And working on the estate, I often felt much more of a detective than a curator. Talking to previous collaborators and other artists trying to piece together Spence's motives. I was left with conflicting statements and a lot of writing by Spence that was very contradictory. She would often change her mind about things. So her practice is like her lived life, taking twists and turns, shifts in direction and changes of heart. And I think this is a really important thing to remember as an institution and as a curator, that nothing is ever that clear. So how do we move from a curatorial revisionism that tidies up a person's life and motives to a more interrogative model that speaks back to the archive through different voices? And I wanted to end with a few questions that I've been kind of thinking about which could be used as provocations for the discussion. So how do we use the logic of Joe Spence's archival impulse and maintain that logic in an exhibition or a project? How do you represent the story or a story or the stories when the archive is fragmented and contested and not always coherent? And what I think a lot about is when and where do I put my own voice or leave my voice out of the story that's also outside of my own lived experience in different ways? What is lost and gained when Spence's material enters an institutional setting? And I think this is a kind of question in terms of a lot of the work that's been discussed tonight. So really it's kind of about the possibilities and dangers, I think, of this work coming into institutions and how we kind of protect the original logic of the work and the stories around it. So yeah, that's my kind of brief presentation, a whistle-stop tour of my work with Joe Spence. And I'll stop sharing. Yeah.
Great, thanks for that. That's fantastic. I was speaking with the mute on, which is a typical kind of issue we come upon nowadays, isn't it? Yeah. So we're gonna take a couple of questions, and a lot of that is partially for the benefit. We're gonna go into our kind of open forum breakout rooms, but that will be private. So we will not be streaming that. But I think for the benefit of YouTube Live, I think it would be really nice to share some of the conversation here. Feel free to unmute your mic. There was a really interesting conversation that took place in the chat that I'd like to highlight. And Ashley asked a question to Lucy. And Ashley, if you're happy, maybe you could, or comfortable with it, maybe you could just ask it here in the room for Lucy to answer, because I think it would be really good for everyone that would be on the YouTube Live to hear it as well.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, no, I was just asking to Lucy earlier on whether she had a kind of baseline for the project she was working for and kind of what material would be moderating through it. Because socially engaged art, you know, has the bad, the good and the ugly in it, really. I just wondered if there was some kind of key point there that there was some kind of what's the limit, what can be put on there?
It's a really, really good question. Thank you for that. And it's one that we don't have a kind of fixed answer to at this stage. I would say that for, you know, as a starting point, I think we will want to try to include as much as we possibly can. So I don't think we'll have I don't think there'll be a moderation in the sense of kind of whether we believe it to be good enough quality or not. I think there'll be a baseline will be that it can, I think my baseline certainly, and we haven't completely agreed with it, my baseline would be that there is that something, an asset of some kind is submitted to the library, you know, some artifact. What that is, I think is really open to the artists who want to take part in this to kind of to help us work out. Obviously it's an online archive. When prior to this, when we were thinking of more of a face-to-face, you know, a lived, you know, meet space library, it maybe could have been different. We were thinking, could you get a car in there? You know, could you get a building in there? No, probably not. Whatever it is has to be something that we can digitize and get online. Other than that, I think it would be great for there to be some short text or story to explain the meaning of this. So I always use the example of you know, the Museum of Broken Relationships in Zagreb, which I think is a really great example of how we would kind of envisage this working, where you were invited to share an artifact that represents a broken relationship in your life. You can submit a shoe or a bus ticket or a mirror or a bicycle, whatever that might be, as long as it comes with a short story that explains why you've submitted that item and what, you know, what your story was. And I think that's kind of the idea that we want with this project too. So you can submit something very ephemeral, you know, as long as you kind of explain why it's relevant and what that relates to in your practice. I think that's fine. But yeah, I think in terms of moderation, I think that would only happen if something contravened our kind of codes of conduct. We will certainly have, you know, regulations of things that we would not accept, but not on the grounds of quality, only on the grounds of it not being material that we would want to share publicly.
Great, thank you. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Give a shout out, feel free to unmute and share something. We've got also from YouTube Live, a conversation happening about unpacking the distinction between collecting objects and artifacts. A key distinction here seems to be a difference between collecting objects and artifacts in times of trauma as opposed to stories. And in response to the social art library, you need a new word. You're neither talking about a museum or a library. A museum is a collection that's already accepted as art, and a library is a distribution point of what's already accepted as art. So really interesting kind of provocations and things to think about. Anything else that anybody wants to throw out there? Helen?
Yeah, it's a question for Dom, really. I was recently, I attended a lecture online by the, it's the Radical Statistics group, and it was part of History Acts, and it was about collection of data, or kind of use of data to kind of, as a kind of tool to fight. At the time, well, there was a particular group that was looking at people who were being evicted from their homes, and a question came up from it's Dr. Rachel Cohen, who's not mentioned on the description of the lecture, which was about fighting with data, which is quite interesting. And she talked about how when you're collecting data, the idea of collecting data from people, but how could you turn it so that you're allowing people to or enabling people to generate their own data. And I'm really interested in that idea, and I don't really know. And we talked about this idea of people having phones in their pockets and kind of collecting data about their own lives. But so I just wondered if you had any sort of thoughts about that, really, about those different ways, of researching, collecting data, all those things.
No, that's a really thank you, Ellen. I've got more questions in return than answers, but I'll tell you what we and I've been thinking about in relation to COVID. I mean, there is we at some point we were very interested. We were thinking about how can we collect, for example, data around mortality rates, and how the mortality rates affect different social demographics differently as an object itself to reflect kind of contemporary conversations around the disproportional death of BME individuals during the pandemic. There is like technically there is lots of problems around even collecting already formed data, because you end up into lots of questions around GDPR, and I'm not even starting going there, about ownership of and retention of individual data for archiving, and so it's a kind of a minefield. So, but one way around it is to have obviously artistic intervention, or like an artist responding to data and visualized data without necessarily relying on the sort of data set. So I have got lots of one thing that I personally was interested in and I'm still pursuing is to think about how, for example, you could collect data for mobilities on Citymapper to track down how many journeys didn't happen, or how the sort of mobility around London changed during the lockdown, that kind of thing. But again, I'm apologies, I'm not able to give you a very sort of a very exhaustive answers on this.
Thank you. And I think we'll just do one more question from Sophie. Sophie, are you happy to share that? It's quite a good one, very provocative.
I think it's related to stuff that's come up around this idea of the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's been mentioned a couple of times, and I think I'm not sure who it's directed to, maybe Lucy, but it could be to anyone or not, anyone out there. The issue of positive spin that an archive might provoke or provide. Not saying that's all bad, but what if how to avoid that, how to tell stories that don't necessarily always want to be told. I guess, Lucy, sort of connecting to your other sort of hat in terms of the work on failure, and for me these are questions connected to the question of governance, and not only which voices are being collected, but who is making decisions on a kind of structural governance level for these institutional spaces, or artist-run led spaces, which are equally fraught with hierarchies and power relations and things.
Yeah, that's another really, really good question. Thank you for that. And again, I probably don't have anything very satisfying to say at this point. I mean, I hope this doesn't sound like too much of a weak answer, which would be that at this point, the aspect of the library, which is where we are inviting people to submit documentation of their projects in whatever form that ends up being, I see as very much a user-generated activity. So it's an open invitation, I hope, to anybody involved in social projects. So I guess initially it will primarily be artists who will submit projects, potentially projects that they've already finished. But I think an aspiration that we have is that the facility that we provide on the website has a kind of a way to document a project in real time. So there's a kind of private space where you can be documenting what's going on, and that project may have multiple users who each get to submit their own kind of things to this kind of documentation package, and only some of those things have to be made public. It doesn't all have to be immediately made live. This can be determined as the project goes on. But I think we're really, really keen that there are these multiple stories, even within the same project where possible, and that it could even theoretically be a space where artists and the people that they're working with can stay in touch, can keep can be negotiating the kinds of stories that they want to share together, rather than it being the artist does this maybe after a project is finished, probably for the purposes of evaluation. I don't know quite how that will work yet, but I think that's certainly something we want to think about. And ensuring that we do get a diversity of different voices, different projects, is something we're going to have to think really hard about in terms of how we share this invitation, how we get that out there.
Right.
I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts.
I might ask George to jump in.
Yeah, my mind's going in lots of different directions with that one, really, because the governance of a place like Wellcome Collection is so big, and you have the library, the archive, and I sit within exhibitions. I just think of it in relation to exhibition making, and I guess we do so much consultancy work and bringing people in with lived experience, and I feel like my role as a curator is to kind of create platforms for as many different kind of diverse voices as possible to speak back to the material, often actually disagreeing with the archival material. I often think, what does it mean to kind of to exhibit? Is that a form of advocacy? Working with the Jo Spence material, it was highly contentious. A lot of people didn't actually agree with what she was saying. So I wanted to kind of create more rounded kind of narratives through kind of roundtable conversations, working on an extensive public program, sort of removing my voice from that. So opening up conversations rather than kind of writing essays around the show. But I think it's important to just kind of constantly question how we collect and why we collect and who we're collecting for. Again, Wellcome is such an extensive collection, which is really a social history collection, where artifacts and artworks sit alongside manuscripts and books, and it's all kind of treated in the same way. So I think it's quite an interesting example of a collection, whereas my background is really within kind of working with artists and working with artworks. So really, historically, like, the artwork gives me the mandate. I always think that artwork gives me the logic to kind of go and speak to certain people. It's a meandering answer, but it's a big question.
Yeah, I mean, this is a space that's not really about finding solutions or being the experts. It's really a meetup for us to all come with ideas of how we might unpack the ways that we work and the ways that we are living today, which is an incredibly complex time. I'm going to stop the YouTube live stream, and we're going to put us into breakout rooms to be able to kind of speak more about this topic in a smaller way for a very short amount of time, and then we'll come back into the Zoom. If you're on the YouTube live, thank you for joining us. We will have monthly meetups the 3rd of the month. And this is for Social Art Network London. They will all be streamed on YouTube Live. They're just the presentations, and it will be captioned afterwards. That is ticketed just to keep the space small on Zoom so that we can go into the breakout rooms and have more kind of complex conversations around it. But also there is a shared document that is on the Social Art Network website for the London June meetup, and each of the meetups will have their own shared document. A lot of chats have been happening both on YouTube Live and on Zoom. People have been sharing links already, really incredible stuff. A lot of the time these things get lost. We're having a conversation about radical archiving. We're going to put that all in that document. You're also invited to add it there.